Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, everybody, and my name is Atul Tripathi. I'm an honorary adjunct fellow at National Maritime Foundation. Today, in the part of this ESG analytics and green finance, in the lecture number 13, we will be talking about how do you track green finance and what are the various measurements, verification, and accountability factors that one needs to take care of when one is handling this green finance and ESG analytics around it. So let's get started immediately and jump into this very interesting topic today. First of all, we have to understand the flow to the proof. That is what we're trying to understand. Trying to understand what is green finance and how you marry it with the real life, situations as it is emerging. Global finance flows are likely to surpass $1.5 trillion in 2023. But you need to have a rigorous MRV so as to ensure that there's a of measurability and verifiability as far as the impact is concerned. And that brings us to the fact that climate finance has reached $1.46 trillion in 2022 and is likely to exceed $1.5 trillion in 2023. Primarily, it is going to be led by all kind of renewables or electricity. The wind and the solar energy are going to be the main focus areas. Now, if you look at this entire landscape, you can clearly see what are the various government sources to your commercial, to your multilateral, to corporations, and the flow of the capital across the various instruments with the uses, and finally about where is it heading towards, what is the destination. That is the important factor, because you see why are we even trying to track this flow? Because scaling is rising fast, and then the climate finance industry, it is hitting about $1.46 trillion as we discussed. So, and it's going to surpass by 2023. It has already surpassed, I would say, by 2023. It's about $1.5 trillion plus now in 2025 when we look at it. So, what are we trying to track? We're trying to track all kind of instruments: this green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, concessional and blended finance, something we have discussed a lot in depth in the last few lecture series. Then what about the channels, the MDBs, the FIIs, your banks and the central banks, DFIs, all that stuff that has happened. The sector allocations across the board, something we'll also talk today as well. Renewables, your low carbon spreads, and your transportation lead growth, where it's going to be, and in order to understand the deployment and what are the additional factors, that's where the accountability infrastructure comes into picture, because here you're trying to measure and quantify the outputs. You're trying to look at the reporting structures, what are the various performance management factors that one needs to take care of when one is handling the green finance, to verification and assurance and reliability. How are they going to come together? How are we going to close the loop between the finance that has been deployed and the impact on the delivery while it is trying to deter the greenwashing. Something, and another important factor that we will discuss today regarding the greenwashing, the unaccountability, or rather the incorrect accountable measures that are taken, and what is the impact on the greenwashing. We will again talk today in a few minutes down the line. Then you have the evidence-based label markets, because labeled green or social or sustainability, SLB's assurance, and they have accumulated about 5.7 trillion USD and by mid-2024. And the sovereign favor green bonds with momentum with uneven EM participation is underscoring the need for comparable assured impact, so as to have a proper reporting structure regarding sustainability, what is the investor confidence in the sustenance and all that factors. Then the data and technology, something is very, very important in today's world across the board, whether ESG finance is concerned, green finance is concerned, or even ESG analytics. And we have seen multiple use cases of GIS, AI, blockchain, AI-enabled GIS and GIS approach with respect to the blockchain, something we've been discussing. Also, we'll talk about a use case today as well, the approach towards green financing and all that stuff. And then the institutional signals, the World Bank has delivered about, a record of about $6 billion in climate finance in FY 2024, and it is targeting about 45% of the lending for climate by FY 2025. So it is raising the bar on the impact of the disclosure, the adaptation, the mitigation balance, whatever the verification practices across the public finance that needs to be taken into consideration, because they are handling such a large amount of money. And what do the good impact measurement look like? So in terms of clear baselines, the counterfactuals, what about the sector specific matrices that needs to be looked at, outcome attribution, third party assurances, regular and machine readable reporting maps, taxonomies, materiality of standardizations. So, and the fact that, you have to take the materiality and the taxonomies into consideration when one is doing that. So, the actionable steps has to be there for insurers and allocators, because your embedded MRV at a design and it is aligning to the recognized taxonomy so that you can publish it, allocation to impact traceability. So, from publishing all the way down to traceability is what is important for everybody involved there, so that you can have the highest verified effects per size of the dollar that is looking at. In that regard, there's a very good, interesting platform that one can look at, and this is from the Climate Policy Initiative. When one goes down to this platform, you can see what is happening in the climate finance, how has it been happening from 2018 to 2023. They have mapped it out, slightly old data, but then fossil fuel, investments, how have they been rising in the meantime has contributed to an increase of annual about 2022, reaching about $1.1 trillion. What is the impact of the annual finance having moved double between 2018 and 2022? Further fivefold increase requiring about about $47.7 trillion, so as to bring down the control, I would say, the temperatures, the global temperature to about 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2030, which is the goal to be achieved. A very interesting platform, I would suggest, for all to visit. How will you avoid losses when you're looking at the reporting factors? What are the factors of economic damages that will be there? What about the investment mitigations and remaining outside when you're looking at energy, buildings, transportation costs? They have broken it down in terms of your average total finance for various industries, such as energy, transport, buildings, industry, and all these things. And how will you play around with these technologies? Also, very interesting on similar lines with the adoption of finance that has more than doubled between 2018 and 2022, which is about, as I said, about reaching about $76 billion USDs. So I would request all of us to visit this website and check it out. It's a pretty interesting one. One should definitely look at it. That also brings me to the second factor. What happens if there is a mislabeling? When the labels are misled, how misallocation and greenwashing, they are actually draining your investor confidence altogether. Because, you have 85% of the institutional investors, they say greenwashing is getting worse. And yet capital keeps on flowing, and it's widening the trust gap between ESG claims and what are the verifiable outcomes that needs to be taken into consideration, because 85% of the investors say greenwashing is worsening, and this is as per EY Global Institutional Investor Survey of 2024. So the question happens to be why and what is happening in the misallocation and the greenwashing. It is actually, when you look at it from the perspective of the market confidence, it is eroding the confidence in the market first. Basically what you're doing is you're breaking the trust of the investors, whether institutional investors or individual investors, between the capital that has been deployed and what is a verifiable outcome. And what is prompting that is resulting in a prompting of a stricter supervision and assurance and MRV requirements, so as to protect the investors and the credibility of ESG investment itself, because that's the main factor that needs to be taken into consideration. Because why is the confidence eroding? The fundamental question that needs to be answered. Essentially, two reasons. One, capital can be allocated to green labels without any clear baselines, additionality, attributions, and it's leading to weak or unproven outcomes, which is relative to the scale of climate finance, which needs a fueling, and it's actually leading to fueling of skepticism. And where is the real impact on the ground? What is the deliverable factors that has been taken into account? That's the first point. The second is, investors are increasingly reporting concerns. So surveys are highlighting greenwashing, becoming worsening problem, because that is where the undermining of the decision is coming into picture, because there are loss of confidence in disclosures and manager claims, and that's leading to headlines in terms of the global headlines with labeled markets. So that is where 85% of the factor from the investors is coming into picture. What should be the response? The response is primarily going to come from the supervisors. When I say that, what I mean is the EU regulators, they have started to move to curb the misleading claims through targeting of the fund naming guidelines, and they've set up a comprehensive greenwashing supervisory agenda where they're trying to safeguard the investors' protection, taking into consideration and the market integrity across the board as far as sustainable investment value chain is concerned. And India's evolving BRSR code is another important an initiative in this direction in India itself, where you're looking at assessment, assurance, and value chain coverage, and you're signaling that there is a tighter expectations on the data quality, the comparability, the accountability to counter the greenwashing, and you're trying to restore the confidence of the people back into the market. So that's where the supervisor's role is becoming very, very essential. How do these misallocations show up? That's one fundamental question that one is always asking, because you see the flow growth without robust MRV risk, channeling of funds to low impact or non-additional projects, and that it's creating a perception of performance gap. And that is what is depressing the confidence in the ESG labels and the indices. And the literature flag disclosures, that is another important point, because the reality discrepancies and the proposals, which is quantitative in detection, in terms of greenwashing, severity indexes, you're underscoring the need for externally validated matrices, and so as to align the claims and the outcomes. That is where the problem has started off in terms of misallocation. That's where it is showing up across the board. What do you need to build up this trust? How do you rebuild this trust? That's the question. So one is embed MRV. You should have explicit baselines, sector matrices, counterfactuals, third-party verifications to tie the flows, and then it has to be measured. Assurance of impact. How will you deter your misleading claims that have been put up across the board? That's the first step. Second is also in terms of strengthening the disclosure regime. So you should have a clearer taxonomies defined. You should have the fund naming rules that have to be very clearly set. Phased assurances across the board in terms of assessments such as European Union or SEBI's BRSR that is there. Machine readable reporting to enhance the comparability and enforcement. That is what is the important factors. And the investors are looking to the relevant signals, which is going to come essentially from the scale of the climate finance, which is going to underscore your urgency. But the confidence will depend on the credibility of the allocation and the verification of the sources and of the funds that have happened, the supervisors and the standardization setting that has been taking place by various authorities, either EU or SEBI as in India. The tightening of the guardrails, because so that the growing flows is going to translate into validated and outcomes across, rather than just make a headline around it. That's the main idea and the main perspective around it. The next point is another in the similar lines is capital isn't about tracking. It's also about transformation that needs to be taken into account, because you're looking at the accountability of the sustainable finances backbone. And therefore, promises don't decarbonize. You can only track them down, but it has to be converted into the ground outcomes, And if you look at this diagram, it talks about the institutional behaviors, the sectoral barriers, and what are the activities that are needed to take into account, which is going to result in producing a right result so that the impacts can be measured. And this is what is all about, because you have to define the backbone, first of all. When I say defining the backbone, that means the accountability has to be continuous, and it has to be measurement, reporting, and verification. These are the three important points. Measuring, reporting, and verifying results. Plus the independence of the assurance. So I am confident that whatever is happening is independent of anything, and it has been verifiable by the independent auditors which have taken. And you have to link the money in motion to the audited outcome. So when money is flowing in across the board, what about the auditor that has happened across? Has it really taken shape for what it was meant for? Not just for the intentional purpose. And why is tracking in non-negotiable? Because the untracked capital, the risk in miscalculation and greenwashing and eroding the confidence of the investor. Therefore, it is going to raise the cost of the capital for the genuinely green projects, which we have to take into consideration. And what to track is what is important point. One is the input slash outflows, which is like instrument size, tenor, sustainability, sector, geography. What about the outputs that you need to look at? One is assets installed. Two is the beneficiaries who were served at the end of the day. And the outcomes, third point in this regard is the performance versus baseline and counterfactuals that have taken place. And fourth and most important point is impact. You have to understand the impactfulness of the entire thing. So we have to verify each side's effect on what are the uncertainty bounds, what are the additional tests that you need to take into consideration. Because the assurance spine, as we call it, is very important, because the third party verification of taxonomies, that is the use of proceeds, KPIs and impact claims, periodic re-verification, so as to catch the drift and sustain credibility. That is going to form your assurance spine, quote unquote. Then you have to design for the traceability. That means the allocation of reports to the project IDs. What about mapping your KPIs to your sectoral standards that have been set across the board? Publishing the methodologies, very, very important factor in this regard. Baselining, data provenance will have to be taken into consideration. Then your use of digital MRV, that is your measurement, reporting, verification approach. Say digital can be in terms of IoT, in terms of sensors, in terms of satellite data. We'll talk about a satellite data case, how this is going to be there, is being used currently in a few minutes down the line. And so as to reduce the lag and the biases, the feedback to the capital allocation in terms of, you have to, the use of the verified impact per dollar and risk adjusted outcomes so as to reweight the portfolio if required. Tighten the sustainability linked covenants and reprioritize any high additional pipelines that might be required. Policy is going to be another important point in this similar regard, because the regulators are going to reward your verified document. When I say that, what I mean is the tax, whether it has been taxonomy aligned or not, what are the funding naming rules, or what about the auditing and the reporting factors that have been taken into consideration to create a system which has been tracked across the board, and there's an impact tower going to lower your friction, and it's going to accelerate your transition finance. So the main point to be considered is it's not measured, it's reported and independently verified, and it can't be counted as a transformation. Accountability is all about operating systems of the sustainable finance. That's an important point that needs to be taken into consideration, because you're now trying to move from the label to all the way to legacy systems. So how green finance is actually flowing through the systems across the board, because in 2023 and 24, UK has allocated about 11.9 billion pounds of green financing to eligible expenditures across clean transport, energy efficiency, renewables, and all these things. This is as per HM Treasury Allocation Report 2024. And you have the government, you have the finance and the citizens. They are forming your green finance triangle, which is movement of the flow across the system that is taking place. Because so the green financing, then it is moving through a life cycle from the labeled capital commitment to the project deployment and auditing, reporting with MRV, that is measurement and verification, and assurance is there in connecting each step so as to maintain the traceability factor. So this has its own life cycle which needs to be considered. So when I say life cycle, I mean the origination. Where is who are the issuers, whether they're sovereigns, they're corporate, they're DFIs, multi-label institutions, or banks that are there. How are they designing the green finances which have been aligned to eligible taxonomies, and how are you trying to publish the frameworks across the board? We are trying to do, how are you defining your use of proceeds, the governance of for selection and the management of the projects that need to be taken into consideration. So that forms your originating factor. Then comes in the issuance, instruments such as green bonds, sustainability linked bonds, loans, blended finance vehicles. How will you raise the capital in market? What are the various features or the approaches that you take into consideration when second party opinions are there, or external reviews is an assurance as far as to validate the alignment. Then third point comes in after the origination issuance, it comes in the allocation, where you're looking at the proceeds which have been tracked internally, and it has been allocated to eligible projects within the defined window. So say it can be 12 months, it can be 24 months, based on the kind of project timeline we're looking at. What is happening with the unallocated balances that needs to be taken into consideration as far as allocation is concerned, and who's going to be held accordingly with the treasury policies until the disbursement takes place. What is the approach that one needs to take into consideration? The fourth point in the life cycle is regarding implementation. So the capitalized now is going to be deployed through loans, equity, grants, guarantees to the projects across various sectors. Sometimes they are mobilizing private finance, via risk-sharing tools and blended structures. So what is the implementation factors? How will you implement this entire capital allocation? Then comes in the fifth point, which is regarding the reporting of this thing. So reporting again provides the issuers with an allocation of reports and impacting of the report following the harmonized framework. One of the frameworks is ICMA HFIR. That's one of the the harmonized frameworks that is used. So you're including your project lists or portfolio summaries, your methodologies, your transparency for the impact estimation, the verification and assurance that is there, the external, that comes in as the sixth point. When you're looking at the external reviewers and you're trying to assure the allocations and the impact the claims, and what is against the various frameworks, what are the indicators, what are the strengthening investor, how will you strengthen it across the investor confidence with respect to market integrity. And finally comes in the final step in the life cycle is regarding the feedback loop, where you're verifying the outcomes into future pipelines, the allocation decisions, the tightening of the eligibility criteria that needs to be taken into consideration. How will you improve your mobilization towards higher additional opportunities? Who's going to, the next point comes is, who will challenge the fool? So you have the public and development sectors, such as DFIs. They're co-financing, they're guaranteeing, subordinating the debts, and what about technical assistance to de-risk and mobilize private capital towards green projects, particularly EMDE context. The second set who can channelize the flows is a sovereign route. We're looking at proceeds via budgets to be eligible expenditures, publishing allocations, impacting on the reports of the programs, so as to have an evidence and outcome-based approach. And the third in this regard is the corporates and the financials, where they're trying to integrate eligibility screening into lending, investment operations, your reporting factors, which is going to be annually until the full allocation of the bond maturity has happened. And this is often using the portfolio level reporting and numerous small projects. So the third point in this regard is from when we are trying to look at the green flows, across the system. Third important point is what is going to be tracked. That's another thing. Okay, I know the life cycle, I know who is going to channel the flows, but what are you going to track it out? And that is where the input and the financing terms becomes very important, because you're looking at instrument, the size, the tenor, the concessionality, what are the sectors you're targeting, which are the geographies, and it has to be defined in a very clear-cut terms. How will the capital enter the system? What are the risks involved? How will it exit, both based on the projects that is there, the outcome and the deployment, how will you take that? What are the assets that have been installed? Beneficiaries, how have they saved? What about the commissioning milestones, so as to have an evidence-based approach? Then comes in the outcomes and the impact, where you're looking at what are the emissions that have been avoided, grid factors, the methodology choices, and finally the attribution and the allocation approach. That also brings us to another important point in the similar regard is the standardization and the guidance. So you have ICMA green bond principles and harmonized framework for impact reporting, which is setting the core components, because you're trying to use the proceeds, the project selection, management of proceeds, you're reporting with recommended indicators, tracking guidance from networks like IDFC, which is where you're providing methods to estimate the share of financing associated with mitigation, adoption, nature positive activities, use of proceeds as it is known. Then you can also have, in terms of standardization and guidance, is the national frameworks which is operationalizing these principles with internal systems from proceeds management, timelines for full allocation, and the public reports that is there. So one of the reports that is very popularly used in India is the REC India Green Finance Framework that is there. So you also have to have a standardization factor to be taken into consideration. Because once we move through the green finance flows across the system, we also need to look what about the eligibility in terms of the evidences that have been impacted. So how will the eligibility without measurement is a promise. It's only a promise because you're looking at taxonomy aligned activities. So any activity in environment sustainable if substantially contributing to one of the 6 objectives does not significantly harm others and meets minimum safeguards. That is as per EU taxonomy explainer. So these are the various principles looking at in terms of your eligible activity to evidence-based impact, because the EU taxonomy has a purpose and a very, very clear scope which has been defined, which is coming in terms of classification of the systems where you're defining the criteria for environment sustainable economic activities, which have been divided up into 6 various objectives, very clear-cut mentioned, in terms of your mitigation, adaptation, your water or marine, your circular economy, pollution prevention, and biodiversity ecosystems. That is what the EU taxonomy has a very clear purpose and the scope defined. And then the alignment required substantial contribution to any one of the objectives. So DNSH to rest and the compliance with minimum social safeguards. So you can have a technical screening criteria specifying the thresholds and the matrices by activities. So the GBP as a discipline, if you look at it, it is about translating the eligibility into financeable projects via the 4 pillars, again very clearly defined in terms of use of proceeds, evaluation and selection, management of proceeds, and reporting. So these are the 4 different pillars, with recommended external reviews and indicator handbooks. So you have to prioritize your impact metrics that we need to take into consideration. And when you look at it, you've also got to connect this in practice all over the place. That's where, issuers are mapping your eligible projects to taxonomy-based activities. Your TSC, that means technical screening criteria. What about the disclosure in GBP alignment frameworks? Allocation and impact of the reports, they present KPIs. So how many megawatts were saved, how many megawatts were installed, what are the beneficiaries, what are the methods and the baselines we were looking at. Because the EU bond standard, which is called as EUGB, it's tightening the link by requiring at least 85% of the proceeds be taxonomy aligned. Plus, there is a mandatory pre-test, post-issuance reporting and ESMA supervised external reviewers to curb the greenwashing. So it is becoming a very, very tightening game. A complete chain has to be being created. And therefore, the reporting and the assurance implications are very important because the companies and the financials subject to EU disclosure rules, they are reporting taxonomy alignment, eligibility. What about the use of standardized templates? How will you improve your comparability? Feeding the investor with due diligence on green and the use of proceed instruments. Then you have the external reviews and that is there and assurances such as EUGB and GBP practices, which is increasing your reliability and alignment and impact claims across the board so as to reduce the green risk premium from greenwashing concerns and reinforcing the market integrity altogether. So that is why the eligibility to evidence-based impact is becoming a very, very important factor in today's world. So that brings me to another point on the similar lines, and that is how will you measure the impact matrices when, as the green finance is going to travel across the entire system? Because the issuers should report both the allocations and impact, and how will it be? What are the indicators, transparent methodologies? This is as per ICMA Harmonized Framework for Impact Reporting 2024. This is a very important factor because ultimately you have to showcase to the world how the thing has moved. So the climate matrices in terms of, say, carbon dioxide reduction, if you take it. So you have to define ex ante versus post case. What is the ex ante estimates were there and with respect to generation and savings that were there. Ex post, how will you measure the data, grid emission factors, disclosure formulas, the typical indicators such as, if you take carbon dioxide as an example, the annual electricity generation, what about the installed capacity, energy saving, how will you avoid various recognizing factors, what are the good practices, the best practices, in terms of publishing the baselines, the emission factors, the counterfactual logics, the portfolio versus project attribution. How will you align with HFIR tables for renewable and energy efficiencies? That is where the biodiversity matrices, if we look at it, comes in terms of indices and proxies. So use of biotic and abiotic indicators, richness, abundance, habitat, extension, connectivity. So you have landscape integrity index, which is aligning to your Cumming-Montreal GBF and TNFD metrics architecture. What about choosing the indicators that are relevant for the intervention logic? Similarly, when you look at it for the social economic benefits in terms of access and inclusion of jobs and everything else, what are the common indicators in terms of people with impoverished or with improved access to essential services such as energy, water, transportation? What about the affordable housing units, jobs that have been created, safeguards are there, SME loans to targeted population, the health, education, service utilization, integration of your social metrics in the green projects which is relevant. So cutting across MRV and attribution, when we look at it, it's always disclosed with the baselines, counterfactuals, emissions, impact factors, attribution factors, Then you're aligning with to ICMA, HFIR sector tables and providing machine readable annexes, independent assurance of allocation and the impact that is there, whether it is limited or reasonable. How will it improve the comparability, and the investor confidence has to be restored with the reported matrices. In this regard, if we look at one of the metrics that is there, very popularly available, when we look at this content, from Green Bond Principles, which is clearly stating all the recommended notes with respect to things. And then you have the green projects where you're defining your, say, renewables, what are the subcategories that are there. There's a very good Excel sheet one is looking at, you can see it in terms of projects that are there, what are the categories of the projects. So I'm just taking one of them into consideration, the renewables, and I'll run through some of the things. What are currencies that have been amount in terms of the currency amount, the share of the thing, the eligibility of the green bond, whether it is what percentage, how much has been signed, what has been the fund that has been allocated in terms of the thing. The core indicators such as, again, very important point is based on the sector that is there. So here, if you look at renewable energy, what is the core indicator? One, how much is the annual GHG emissions reduced or avoided? This is coming in terms being measured in terms of the tons of carbon dioxide, which is, if you select one of them, the multiple factors that have been put in. Similarly, there are other things like core indicators, two, which is again the annual renewable energy generation in megawatt or gigawatt electricity, what the joules energy, amount of joule energy, gigajoules or terajoules energy that was produced. The core third indicator is additional capacity of the renewable energy plants that were constructed or rehabilitated in megawatt terms. So this is again, you have other sustainability indicators for renewable energy. There are these various indicators that say multiple of them across the board, clean transportation, things like that, green buildings, then you have biodiversity, a multiple of them, quite a number of them. And then you can correlate this with the nature related projects as well, the nature solutions where the GFB target, what is it there, all the targets that have been set with respect to the portfolio allocation, names that are there, to which portfolio have you set, amount, the shares, the project in terms of percentage, eligibility for the green-related bonds, are you there or not, project categories, the component, what about the amount that has been allocated, what about the project for the average portfolio timeline, again, the core indicators one needs to look at across the board, the other sustainable indicators that are there. So one should definitely go to these kind of approaches like this nature-based solutions, biodiversity, nature-based solutions, energy efficiency. What about the reduction in chemical part? Quite a number of summary table for the portfolios or the project allocation that is there in this regard. And therefore, we come to another important point is, again, about building the trust is the second party opinion that's very, very important, because any second party opinion, they are independent, they are point in time reviews of a green and sustainable financial framework, the instruments, how you assess the alignment with the market standards, the green bond principles, green loan principles, sustainability linked frameworks, and the credibility of eligible categories and the KPIs. So when you look at it, the issuers and the European Green Zone must contract an independent external reviewer, and you have to register and be supervised by ESMA for pre-issuance and post-issuance reviews. This is as per EU Green Bond Regulation summary that is there. This is just a summary, and then you have the assessments across the board. So solar plants, energy efficiency building, hybrid roads, healthcare, conventional steel production, new oil. When it is red, and when it all these are, some sectors are very, very red because they're highly if you look at oil and this red being because they're highly conventional use of energy that is then highly polluting. Similarly, it's dark green because the assessment is because solar energy is a very, very non-polluting industry. What are the activities that needs to be taken care of? So you take the case of energy efficiency building, activities that represent significant steps towards LCCR futures, and what is the further improvement in terms of long-term LCCR solutions that needs to be taken into consideration. So essentially, what exactly is the second party opinion, or SPO as it is called as? There you are evaluating the use of proceeds of or sustainability linked frameworks. You're checking the governance, you're checking the project selection, the management of proceeds, what are the reporting commitments against recognized principles, and what is relevant, what about taxonomic criteria. Then comes in the second point in the coverage for SPO is your opinion type. So where you're providing an external view on the alignment and the expected environmental social contribution. It is not a credit rating, and it does not guarantee you an allocation. It does not verify the realized impact post assurance. Then you have to have an evidence based where the reviewer is issuing documentation, eligibility criteria, looking back period, the exclusion of the list, planned indicators, any comments that are needed, any additional factors that need to be taken into consideration. What about the anticipated impact? So, but the question happens to be, why do these SPOs even matter? Because one, there's an investor confidence that needs to be taken into consideration, because it is adding your pre-issuance credibility, helping investors compare frameworks and reduce your greenwashing risk. Very important point. Second, SPOs are important because of market access and pricing, because it will broaden the buyer base. It will support the tightening pricing by signaling robust alignment to standards. It will ensure that there is a regulatory environment. So for regimes like EU green bond standards, or external reviews are integral. You're trying to demonstrate a taxonomy alignment is there. There's a proper disclosure. So these are the primary three reasons why SPOs actually matter. And when you look at a SPO, what are the good practices? So one is clear mapping. You must have an explicit linkage of eligible criteria to recognize taxonomy, technical screening criteria wherever it is applicable, transparent thresholds that do not significantly harm any criteria. Second is the method transparency, where you're looking at disclosures of the intended allocation timelines, pro rata attribution methods, impact calculation approaches, baselines, and data sources. And third is it limits the acknowledgement. So you have a clear statement that the opinion is point in time, not an assurance of future allocation or realized impact, and that the post-issuance verification sits outside your SPO, that is your second party opinion. And how do these SPOs differ from other checks? Because SPO versus external verification or assurance, when you look at is, SPOs assess the framework alignment ex ante, and assurance engagements, they test the actual allocation and impact data post. SPO versus credit rating, when you look at from the other checkpoints, is SPO do not opine on credit risk at all and repayment capacities. They focus on sustainability, alignment, and anticipated impact that might be taking place when the flow of the capital is taking place across the board. So practically for issuers, if you look at it, it is preparing a robust framework where you are defining the eligible categories, governance, reporting, alignment, recognized principles, exclusions of criteria, looking back rules. You are engaging early because you're giving them a pre-brief in the opinion provided, and you're sharing the data template for indicators for speed review and improve the clarity. You are planning for the continuum because they're pairing the SPO with the post-issuance allocation and impact reporting and considering the independent assurers. So that should complete the accountability chain. And that is why the second party opinion is becoming very important in today's world of the capital allocation and capital movement that is taking place. Therefore, we also need to look at another important factor on the similar lines is the climate bond certification. This is where the science is being used to, as per the Paris alignment frameworks, finance frameworks, because the version 4.x is extending certification beyond the use of proceeds of bonds to assets, entities, and general purpose instruments with transition target. This is as per climate bond standard itself. And if you look at the climate bonds initiative proceeds of the development and the ISEAL provisions that need to be taken into consideration, there's a very good tabulated manner in which the information is being provided out here. What does it cover? The question happens to be that the certification is now spanning the use of proceed instruments. It is looking at the assets, the non-financial entities that are existing, the coverage in terms of general purpose debt, where the entity has been a science-based target is to be taken into consideration, the credible transition plans, the meeting of the disclosure requirements. How does it even work? That's another question. You have the selection criteria, the sector criteria, which is where you're defining the eligible for each sector. You're looking at the issuers, you're engaging in an approved verifier and a pre-issuance assessment. Upon the certification mark is granted. And what exactly is this 4.x, that new 4.x that has come into picture, as far as the climate bond certification is concerned? It is expanding the scope to entities and performance related instruments, pathways for planned assets and early stage R&D, and finally looking at the resilience of the taxonomy linkages, where you are providing the interim criteria for adoption and resilience of investments where there's a pending sector validation. And therefore the accountability mechanics has to be taken into consideration, because the mandatory post assurance and the potential periodic checks will help to determine, or rather to deter greenwashing. Why should even the investors take care of this climate bond certification? That's a very valid question. Because the independent and it is science-based criteria with a supervised verifier ecosystem, where you're creating a comparability across various issuers, sectors, and you're providing, or you're looking at improving your diligence quality and potentiality of supporting the tighter pricing or your deeper demand that is there, because that is where the relationships to other labels is coming into picture, because it is complementing your ICMS, GBP by adding formal certification and sector threshold that can be used alongside regional taxonomies and the disclosure of the regimes, so as to demonstrate the alignment and the strengthening of the impact claim. So if desired, you're looking at a very clear-cut certification based chain that is there, and the post and the issuance across the board. So that brings us to another interesting factor, and the impact of the matrices by the sectors. So we've seen some of the examples a few minutes ago. Also, let's look at it slightly more deeper out here. So they're actually indicators that are going to travel with the capital along with each sector, for each sector. So indicators such as TCOED, carbon dioxide, E avoided, megawatt generated saved, megawatt installed aligned with HFIR. They are considered some of the best practices, market practices across the board. This is as per independent reviewer So if you look at this diagram, oil and gas industry to business illegal, public sections, what are the meeting of criteria, customers, what about the attractive your motive and the certain retaining the employees, how high to low you're looking at. Various cases, let's take a few of them across the board that is there when you look at the travel of the green finance across sectors. Let's take the case of renewable energy as a case, where the core is the annual renewable energy generation, installed capacity in megawatts, annual GHG reduced or avoided in trillion carbon dioxide emissions, use of location-specific grid factors, disclosures of ex ante and ex post status and attribution methodologies. So you are looking at curtailment rate, capacity factor, transmission capacity served. Then you're looking at energy efficiency. When you look at energy efficiency, you're looking at annual energy saved in megawatts. What is the percentage reduction versus the baselining? Annual GHG avoided in trillion carbon dioxide emissions. Baselining must be recorded. Methods should follow the HFIR table, something we just talked about. So here you're looking at the load factor improvements, metering coverage, rebound consideration. When you look at the clean transportation, you're looking at core passengers or ton per kilometer shifted to low carbon modes, electric vehicles financed or charging points installed. What about the annual GHG avoided in terms of your trillion carbon dioxide emissions, where you're using your modal emission factors and utilizing the data across the board? What is the time travel saved when you look at the factors that need to be supplementary factors? What about the local air pollution reductions that is going to be measured in NOx per particle meter? That is some of the examples. Let's look at some more cases across the board. Let's take another one in terms of water and wastewater. So when you look at it in terms of the core factors, what is the water saved in cubic meter tons, water wasted in cubic meters, how have you been meeting a standard, your leakage reduction redundancies saved in terms of percentage, energy saved when you're looking at treatment in megawatt hours, resulting of how will you looking at the GHG change in terms of trillion carbon dioxide emissions factors. Supplementarily, you're looking at service community, number of hours per day, non-revenue water change percentage terms and measure that. So these are some of the impact matrices that is going to be there across the board when you're looking at a very specific sectors, Then comes another interesting thing is claims and the accountability gaps and why is it holding back your ESG, because the sustainable finance market has been growing and it has been showing a lot of growth across the board. And more institutional investors are reporting sustainability performances. Stock exchanges are helping drive sustainability disclosures. This is as per 2023 report. So sustainable and finance is continuing to grow. Credibility hinges on reliability, comparable information and effective oversight. That is as per UNCTAD World Investment Report 2024. So the accountability challenges in terms of ESG investing clusters around greenwashing risk, data quality, comparability gaps, assurance limits, uneven disclosure, regulatory enforcement, they're together weakening your decision-making usefulness and the investor protection across the board because of sustainable investment value chain. And therefore, the greenwashing risk is coming into picture because misleading your labels and claims, they're appearing in multiple points in the value chain, say from issuers to funds to benchmarks that have been set across the misalignment of taxonomies, and that is promoting the supervisors to escalate oversight and to protect the investors and the market integrity. The major reviews in terms of identifying the greenwashing as a persistent drag on sustainable funds and credibility and undermining the trust in disclosures and allocations. There, despite the growth in market that we see as per these numbers we're looking at, data and comparability gaps, another interesting factor that needs to be taken into consideration. Supervisors, they are citing inconsistency in the methodologies, your opaqueness of the simulation or estimations. There's a limited access to the high quality of data you're looking at. What about the comparable ESG data with respect to your systemic hurdles that are being created to effective supervision and investor diligence? ESMA urges that investment in data infrastructure, the recommendation to clearer rules as far as curbing the misleading information, standardization, sustainability, data processing. So you need to have an assurance and your verification limit. So reports sometimes or a lot of them, I would say, they're lacking the independent assurance on ESG KPIs across the board. Proposed solutions should include your scaling limited or reasonable assurances, your alignment with emerging assurance standards for sustainability disclosures. The national regimes, they are tightening. So let's take the case of India. India's BRSR core, it phases assessed or assured KPIs, the value chain disclosures for large listed firms so as to raise the data quality and comparability, regulatory and fragmentation and enforcement. When you look at it, EU that has intensified action via fund, naming guidance, greenwashing supervisory agenda, common supervisory actions that need to be taken into consideration on sustainability risk and disclosures so as to drive the convergence and the enforcement. Your ESMA calls for resourcing of NCAs and enhancing of the skills, using of the risk-based oversightedness, embedding the EU taxonomy more centrally so as to reduce any ambiguities and improve your enforceability. And therefore, this accountability gaps has to be plugged in so that there is no more, ESG is not more, fund movements are not held back. And, that is where, the fragmentation of that standard is becoming a challenge, because there is across the board, you have inconsistencies as far as the reporting is concerned. The fragmented standards, they are leading to inconsistent reporting because the companies, they are facing overlapping. There's a non-interoperable disclosure regimes such as CSRD and ESRS versus ISSB versus national rules. And then there's uneven assurance expectations. There's a varying data definition which is reducing your comparability and decision usefulness for investors and supervisors, But why does this fragmentation drive inconsistency? Because multiple frameworks, timelines, they are creating gaps, duplications. So the asset managers, when they need data under SFDR and taxonomy, they are often outpaced with the corporate disclosures, and that is where the forcing of the estimates and the proxies by the valid, that is where it is varying by provider and the methodologies. Then the companies begin to cherry pick the frameworks and the metrics, and they're reporting selectively, and they're using different proxies and the baselines. Then evidence from supervisors and the market watchers are becoming very important, because ESMA has long flagged data quality, comparability issues, which are stemming from multiple reporting standards and limited assurance, and warning of the misrepresentation and mispricing of the risk across the value chain. There are certain fixes and the convergence paths that is being worked out. One of them is interoperability work between CSRD and ISSB, which is aiming to report once, use many times, aligning with the climate disclosures, materiality mapping to reduce your duplication or confusion of the paperwork and the users. Supervisors, actions and the new rules that are coming, such as ESMA, CSA on sustainability disclosures, EU ratings regulations. They are focusing on tightening the oversight of data processors and improving the reliability and transparency in ratings and reported matrices. Then you have the national regimes. They are moving towards standardized templates and phased assurances, such as India's BRSR core and the industry standards. So you're looking at improving the alignment with the global norms. And, when you look at it from the practical implications for the preparers, you have the map disclosures to ESRS, ISSB common cores, where you can publish your machine readable data, document the methodologies, baselining to curb any proxy drift across data and users and jurisdictions. You can plan out your phased assurances on the material KPIs so as to align with supervisory expectations and reduce any variability that have been introduced by any unverified estimates across the board. Another factor is why the value chain emissions are mostly there, and what do we need to do it. So the scope 3, this is a very important point. The scope 3 is often where the problem starts, and that is where it becomes unreliable or estimated, because the value chain data is very sparse. inconsistencies being reported across by the suppliers and customers, highly sensitive to methodology choices, where you're forcing the companies and the data providers to use proxies, which has been very widely over the time. And why scope 3 is actually skewing your unreliability, because they're the indirect and diffuse sources. So most of the scope 3 categories sit outside the operational control of the companies, and they're spanning your suppliers, your distributors, your product use, the end of the life, where you're making the primary data collection difficult and uneven. Your methodology sensitivity is there, because this is where the results are being swinging with the boundary choices, baselining, emission factors, attribution rules that are there. So studies have shown that low cross provider correlation with the scope 3 downstream and large year-to-year volatility in disclosed values. What should the supervisors and the standard setters do? What are they doing in this regard? So they're looking at a transition relief and guidance. So ISSB is allowing your initial relief from scope 3 disclosures, and it's proposing a very targeted and adjustments to reduce your burden, and trying to say focus on the decision useful category, say financials itself, Then on the similar lines, the second thing that they're doing is the protocol updates and interoperability. So GHG protocol is revising your scope 3 guidance, and it is mapping to ESRS and with emphasis on data quality grading, category materiality, clearer integration with the jurisdictional rules. So that is where it is moving from the hype to the proof. So greenwashing to overstated or unverifiable claims, because overstated or unverifiable claims look like you have vague adjectives, eco-friendly, carbon neutral. They're not very clearly there without any definitions. Scope, boundary, baselining year, methodologies, all have to be there. You cannot cherry pick your favorable metrics. This is my favorable metrics, and therefore I'm going to look at it, while omitting the material metrics. That is where the challenge of the greenwashing is coming into picture. So the common tactics that is used is, these are hidden trade-offs, highlighting the recycled packaging while product is high in the life cycle footprint, irrelevant claims are being made, say promoting CFC free for products where CFCs are already been banned, while green imagery or labels, they're implying certifications when none actually exists. Green hushing or green wishing is another way, either withholding the data so as to avoid scrutiny, or even set an aspirational targets without realistic pathways with realistic milestones that are there. So, how do you convert these claims into a credible source? Because you're specifying the scope and the boundary. Now you're naming the scopes, you're setting the categories, what are the assets, time frames, publish the baselines, restate the policies so that the users can make progress consistently, show the method and the data, disclose what are the various calculation methods that are there, emission factors, impact factors, allocation, attribution rules, get an independent preview review done. That is very, very important in this regard. That brings us to another important factor, is how to avoid greenwashing, and that's where the use of GIS and artificial intelligence becomes very important, because remote verification is going to let the third party verify the log and into DMRV systems, and without site travel you can cut cost, delays and everything else. And take the case of, this is what the World Bank is saying, Why does geotagging actually matter? Because it ties the financing to precise sites, boundaries, enables asset level checks into existence, size, commissioning. You can measure the outcomes over time and reduce the greenwashing. Because you're greenwashing risk, because you're anchoring claims over observable locations. Solar farms are a very interesting thing. What to verify, if you take it as a case study, you're trying to coordinate with the arrays and substations and construction commission dates, the panel area, growth, grid interconnections, generation metering to validate your megawatt hours. DMRV stack is there, so data layers, satellite, optical for land cover, SAR for all weather structure, LiDAR for canopy height, ground truth in terms of plots, photographs, videos, biocaustics, meter sensors. That is where the stack is coming into picture. So let's take another one as a case study. This is a very interesting one where you're looking at GIS-based spatial making, multi-criteria analysis for your solar farms using GIS, site selection for solar farms using GIS. This has been made on ArcGIS, and when you look at it, it's showing across small province and part in Australia and northeastern part of Australia. the Townsville, and this is where the study has been done, the approach that they have taken regarding the literature review, the factors of Townsville, what will be the output. They did a study on the green structures to state controlled roads, to MES, wildlife fires, land mapping that was done, then the data that was plotted, how would the state road look like, what about the habitat, proximity to power lines. All this was done so as to study and set up a green solar plant, because that is what the idea was. How do you use this thing? And that is where the use of GIS as a technology comes into picture. An interesting case study to look at as far as the geotagging of MRV for location-specific green investment is concerned. That is all from my side for the day. My name is Atul Tripathi, and I'm an honorary adjunct fellow at National Maritime Foundation. Thank you. Swayam Prabha is a very good channel to be associated with, not only as an educator but also as a student. It gives you an opportunity to learn new subjects from industry experts like myself, and also from various professors who are there and experts are there in the field. So this is a new course that I'll be teaching. It talks about ESG, it talks about the analytics around ESG, it talks about the various green financial instruments that are there. We'll talk about risk pooling, we'll discuss about what is the nature of weather indexes, what is the nature of finance that is happening, how is the industry looking at it, what are the legal perspectives, what are the technological perspectives, and also most importantly, what is the analytics perspective that we'll be bringing it out. Swayam Prabha has this government website which is called swayamprabha.gov.in. All you need to do is go down, drill it out, figure out which course is most appropriate for you so that you can find out the best one that is available and which is most applicable for your area of learning. As far as this, the way it is challenged, it is transforming the entire education system, because you see there are a lot of people out there who are spread across the country and they want to get access to good quality education given by professors, experts. This is one of the very good channels to be in.